Hey there, nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and welcome to another edition of Cheap Shots, our series dedicated to showing you how to save money on the wargaming hobby. And on today's episode, we'll show you how to paint an Inquisitorial Agents Kill Team both quickly and, more importantly, cheaply for your games of Warhammer 40,000 Kill Team. By following the tips, techniques, and materials that we suggest, you can paint your miniatures to a beautiful tabletop standard for less than $38, and when compared for materials that you need to purchase from both Army Painter and Citadel, we will help you save over $227 at exactly the same time. So as you can see here, this is the kill team that we'll be working on. This will be the end result for it as well. As you can see, it's actually much larger than what it actually comes in the box set, and the reason why is because I bought two of these box sets to create this kill team. And even though these are used for kill team, I'm not really using them for kill team. I'm actually planning on using it for games of Necromunda instead. So that's what I'm using these guys up for. So if some of the builds or some of the things that get done with these guys doesn't seem like it's all that optimal, that's the reason why, because I'm using these guys from Necromunda instead. So that being said, let's talk about it, guys. Paint these guys up both quickly and, more importantly, cheaply. Alright, so the first thing I do, of course, is to assemble your miniatures. And as you can see, I actually have a combination of both these miniatures as well as the Imperial Cult fighters from Warhammer Quest Blackstone Fortress, because I plan on combining these sets of miniatures together to make one singular gang for my games of Necromunda for my campaign setting. So you can build your guys' kill teams any way that you want. I decided to make one of each of the major different types of fighters are available in that campaign and that supplement. And at the same time, I also did two of the serval skulls as well with books, because I plan on using for like bomb rats or something like that nature instead. So once you have your miniatures assembled, the next thing we gotta do, of course, is to texture the bases. So when it comes to texture the bases, the first thing I like to do, of course, is to paint the bases with wood glue, and then I take sand that I get from my backyard, and I throw that directly onto the parts of the base that I want to have texturing. The reason why I do this is because these are materials that are just lying around my house. They're absolutely free, and they're much cheaper than using Granite from Citadel in order to actually put texturing on my bases. So once again, once the wood glue dries, we're going to add a sealant on top of the texture to make sure that the sealant doesn't come flaking off, the texturing doesn't come flaking off the bases. So for my sealant, I like to make a 50-50 mixture of some wood glue as well as water, and I mix it together until it's about the viscosity of milk, and then I basically put it like a wash all over the texturing, and I let that dry. And the reason why I do that is so that way it creates an airtight sealant so the texturing doesn't come flaking off the bases. And once again, it's absolutely free for me because it's just chemicals I have lying around the house. And once we're done texturing our miniatures, the next thing we got to do, of course, is to prime them. So when it comes to priming my miniatures, I like to use Rust-Oleum Flat White Primer. I buy this in my local Walmart for about $3.99. And what I do is I do the quick once over with the primer directly all over the entirety of the miniatures. Now, priming does a couple of things that are very important to the miniatures painting process. The first thing, though, it helps your acrylic paints to adhere to the surface of your miniatures, because if you were to paint your acrylic paints onto bare plastic, the slightest bit of friction would rub that paint off the miniature and it would ruin your overall finish. And the second thing that priming does as well is that it actually has a large impact on the vibrancy of the colors that you have in your paint schemes for your miniatures. Traditionally speaking, the more bright and vibrant the color scheme, the lighter the primer you want to use. So you use like white primer like I'm using here for very bright, bold colors, and you use like primers like black, for example, for more subdued or darker color schemes. Now, because I'm going to be using an oil wash on these miniatures at the end of it for my washing stage, it's going to really darken down the vibrancy of my miniatures colors. So because I'm using a flat white primer and really bright colors in order to help compensate for that. So the first thing we gotta do, of course, is start applying some flesh tones. And so because I wanted to create some variety of skin tones in my gang, or my kill team rather, I decided to break them into smaller chunks. So for my Deathworld veteran, as well as my Knight Errant, as well as my Interrogator agent, I decided to paint those guys up in flesh tone by Apple Paint. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. And I put 2 thin coats on all the flesh that's exposed for these fighters. For the Hexachromatic Monk, I believe is what he's called, as well as the Auto Savant, for their skin tones, I want them to have a little bit more of a paler one. So I put 2 thin coats of Peaches and Cream by Delta Serum Coat to create that really paled, kind of galt flesh look on these characters. For the Extractor guy with the blades, as well as one of my gun servitors, as well as for the Pistolier, I want a little bit more of a darker skin tone. So for these fighters, I put 2 thin layers of Nutmeg Brown by Apple Paint, and you get this for about 50 cents at your local Walmart. And for the last 3 members of the kill team, which is the diviner, what I believe that guy is, what that character is called, as well as another one of my gun servitors, as well as my penal legionnaire, I decided to put those guys in 2 thin coats of burnt umber by Apple Barrel Paint for 50 cents at my local Walmart to get that darker skin tone on these characters. And then once we're done with the flesh, the next we can move on to now is on the survival skulls. And for the survival skulls, I decided to paint up their skulls in 2 thin coats of khaki paint by Apple Barrel Paint. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. I just paint directly onto the bone that's on these miniatures. And once we're done with that, the next thing we do now is start dry brushing the flesh as well as the bone that we just did earlier. For the monk with the shotgun, as well as the auto savant and the 2 servo skulls, I decided to dry brush their colors with Ivory by Apple Barrel Paint. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents and just did a quick dry brushing on all the exposed flesh and the bone on these characters to create the illusion of depth on the miniature while leaving that darker color in the recesses while the pigments actually highlight the erase surfaces. For my Interrogator Agent, as well as my Deathworld Veteran, as well as my Knight Errant, I decided to dry brush their flesh with Peaches and Cream by Delta Serum Coat. Once again, getting this material from my local Hobby Lobby for about 65 cents. As you can see, it brings a lot of those details we couldn't see earlier. For the fighters whose skin tones I did in Nutmeg earlier, which is the Pistolier, the guy with the blades, as well as one of my gun servitors, I dry brushed them with Flesh by Outer Royal Paint to create that illusion of depth on the miniatures. And for the last 3 fighters I did in Burnt Umber earlier, which is the Penal Legionnaire, as well as one of my gun servitors, as well as the Diviner, I dry brushed their flesh with a thin layer of Territorial Beige to create that highlight as well as those shadows on the miniatures as well. And now that we're done with all the flesh, the next thing we're going to work on now is on the fabric of these miniatures. So the next detail we're going to work on are the fabric. So one of my gun servitors as well as one of my Deathworld veterans over here on the right hand side, I decided to paint up their fabric in 2 thin coats of Holly Branch or Apple Barrel Paint. I'm just basically mimicking the box art at this point. I wanted to create that nice vibrant green color for these guys. So I put 2 thin coats of that. You can get this to your local Walmart for about 50 cents. For both the Penal Legionnaire as well as my second gun servitor, to create a little bit of difference between these sculpts, I decided to use Bright Blue by Apple Barrel Paint. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. I just put this on the fabric for their clothing to make them look different. And the reason why I focus on these 2 groups of miniatures first is because they use exactly the same sculpts for both the Penal Legionnaire as well as the Deathworld veteran and obviously the gun servitors. So to create that illusion of differences between the miniatures, I use different color schemes to create that variety of colors to make them look more different and distinct. Now moving on to the robes for the rest of the kill team. For the guy with the 2 machetes, as well as the pistolier, as well as the auto savant in the background there, I decided to pick up their robes in 2 thin layers of Anita's acrylic in True Red. You can get this at your local Hobby Lobby for about 65 cents. It's a beautiful, vibrant red color that I use for all of our painting needs on this channel, and it looks absolutely fantastic. So I put this on all the robes. It's a very stark contrast to what you have here. It looks very eye-catching as well, and it looks really cool in relation with the other colors that we use for the rest of the kill team. For both the monk with the shotgun as well as the diviner character, I decided to pick up their robes in 2 thin layers of magenta by Deco Art by Americana. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. I put 2 thin coats of this on all the fabric that I wanted to be painted that magenta color, just because it kind of reminds me of like a papal purple color that you see usually associated with religious figures from the Roman Catholic faith. I thought that looked really cool to use on these guys, and that's the reason why I did it. For my Interrogator Agent as well as for Knight Errant, I decided to use 2 thin layers of pigment paint by Apple Barrel Paint. I did this for both their robes as well as the eye patch for the Interrogator on the left hand side, and I did it for the same thing with the Eviscerator as well as the robes and the Knight Errant on the right hand side as well. And lastly, for the 2 servo skulls, I painted one book in bright blue and another book in magenta by Deco Arts Americana. So that way these 2 servo skulls look a little bit different to add some color variety and visual interest to the gang. But at the same time also that way we could tell these guys apart if we decide to use them on the battlefield. So now that we're done base coating all the fabric on these guys, the next thing we gotta do, of course, is a dry brush. I'm using pewter gray for the guys that we did in the black robes earlier, which is the Knight Errant as well as the Interrogator Agent. We do a quick dry brushing with some pewter gray to bring a lot of those details we couldn't see before. Things like the texturing of the fabric and the individual folds of the cloth, for example. And when it comes to dry brushing black, I also added additional dry brush on top of the gray with Pale Gray by Folk Art. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 75 cents. And the reason why I do this is because when I apply oil wash on black miniatures, I find that having the 2 layers of dry brushing kind of translates over really well with the oil washing, so that way you can still see those details. So for the fighters that we did in bright blue earlier, which is the Servo Skull, the Penal Legionnaire, as well as one of the gun servitors, we're going to dry brush their clothing in Sky Blue by Apple Barrel Paint. It's a nice pale blue color you can get at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. As you can see, it brings a lot of those details we couldn't see earlier. For the fighters that we did in magenta, which is the monk with the shotgun, the diviner, as well as the servitor with the book that we did in magenta, we dry brushed that in Cameo Pink by Apple Barrel Paint. It's a nice candy cotton, candy kind of looking pink that you can get at your local Walmart for about 50 cents. As for the fighters that dib in red, which are the Pistolier, the guy with the machete, as well as the Auto Savant, we're going to dry brush their red robes in Tropic Orange or Apple Pearl paint. It's a beautiful dry brushing color to use on red elements that I like to use quite a bit in my painting schemes. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents, and it does a beautiful job of bringing out those details. And the very last bit of dry brush we're going to do on the fabric is for the Death World Veteran, as well as for one of the gun servitors that were done in Holly Branch earlier. We're going to dry brush their clothing in Lime Sherbet. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 50 cents, and it brings in those details we couldn't see earlier. And now that we're done with the dry brushing on the fabric, next thing to work on now is on the leather goods. So when it comes to leather goods, we're going to focus on the black leather goods. First of all, which we're going to use Pavement Paint by Apple Pearl Paint for 50 cents at my local Walmart. I did this for like the tops of the shirts that the gun servitors are wearing, as well as their boots. I also did exactly the same thing with the leather goods for the Death World Veteran, the Pistolier, the guy with the machete, as well as the Penal Legionnaire as well. So things like their boots, for example, cabling and belts that they might have crossing their bodies, and harnesses, gloves, shirts, masks, all those kind of things. And once those details are taken care of, we'll move on to our next set of details. For the rest of the kill team, which will be the Knight Errant, as well as the Interrogator Agent, as well as the boots of the Gun Servitor, as well as the Legionnaire Servitor, I decided to base coat the two fighters on the left-hand side with Burnt Umber by Folk Art. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 75 cents. It's a beautiful reddish-brown color that contrasts nicely with the overall black color scheme that those characters are wearing. As for the Gun Servitor on the right-hand side, as well as the Penal Legionnaire, I decided to dry brush their leather goods, specifically their boots, in Burnt Umber to kind of create this kind of rich, kind of brownish blackish color for their leather goods, just to kind of make them stand out for the rest of the other miniatures in the gang. As for these other two characters, the Knight Errant, as well as for the Interrogator Agent, for their leather goods, I decided to dry brush that in Territorial Beige, just to add that little bit of additional layer of detail on those miniatures. For the Divinator, as well as for the Monk with the shotgun, the Monk's wearing like these kind of parchment that's on his robes, as well as they're both carrying skulls hooked up to chains to their belts. So for that detail, I decided to pick those details out in two thin layers of light mocha. I decided to create that kind of parchment look for the Monk, as well as bring out those skull elements they're also carrying as well. From there, we then go back to the Gun Servitors, and we're using this for their armor. So the Gun Servitors have kind of like this weird kind of bone look for their armor that they're wearing from the box art anyways of the Kill Team box set. So because of that, to create that same look, I am painting all their armor panels in two thin layers of khaki paint. So these are things like the chest rigs, as well as their back, the armor paneling that they have on their thighs, as well as their abdomen, as well as the joints along their, I believe their left-hand arms, which are their left arms, which shows like little pinchers that they have there. So I just put that in two thin layers of khaki paint, and we're ready to move on to our next finer detail. And the fine details we're working on next are on the servitors, the servo skulls, as you can see there. The servo skulls actually have some cabling hanging off their person, so I use three major colors for that. I use Anita's True Acrylic Red, as well as King's Gold by Apple Pearl Paint, which you get your local Walmart for about 50 cents, as well as Pavement by Apple Pearl to bring out those details on those cables. So as you can see, I got yellow, red, and black for the cabling coming off of them, so that way it contrasts nicely against their books, as well as the bone color we use for the skulls. The next fine detail we're working on are things like the weapons of the Gun Servitors, as well as the collar and cuff of the Interrogator, as well as the iconography of the Diviner that's standing right there next to them. So for those details, I decided to pick those out in two thin coats of Anita's Acrylic True Red, and the reason why is because it's the same color as used in the box art that came with these box sets. So you can see on the Interrogator Agent, I decided to pick up that collar in red, as well as the cuff of his long coat. I had that little Inquisitor eye also brought out with that red color from Anita's Acrylic, and the biggest portion I used were for the giant guns for both the heavy bolter as well as the plasma gun carried by both the Gun Servitors. So the next major detail, we're going to work on the weapon casings for the rest of the gang, and as you can see here, I decided to use Tuscan Teal to do that. Now the reason why I use Tuscan Teal is because one, it's a very eye-catching color, and secondly, it contrasts nicely with all of the different browns and bright colors we're using throughout the gang. So for example, the Interrogator Captain on the left-hand side, I use it for his auto pistol as well as the book he's carrying. I use it for the Knight Errant with the shoulder armor that he has on his shoulders. I also use it for the shotgun of the Monk in the center, as well as the hand flamer for the Penal Legionnaire, as well as the pistols for the Gunslinger there on the right-hand side. And to add a little bit more detailing to those weapons that we did earlier in Tuscan Teal, I'm going to dry brush them real quick with some Dutch Aqua. You can get this at your local Walmart for about 75 cents. As you can see, it brings a lot of the mechanical, especially the mechanical features of those weapons. So like the bolt ejectors, the slide, the different safeties and stuff, as well as the texturing on the book as well. So now that we're done with that, we're going to work on some fine details on these miniatures. The first one we're going to work on is the robes of the Knight Errant. The Knight Errant actually has these beautiful piping along the robes that he has around his neck, as well as the edges of his robes. So to get those details, we're going to pick that out in two thin layers of True Red by Anita's Acrylic, so that way it has that nice contrast between the black and the rest of the miniatures clothing. We're We're also going to break protocol a little bit too here with the metallic colors. Usually speaking, whenever I use metallic colors, I like to use it at the very end of the painting process, so that way I don't have to really worry about it too much afterwards, so that way it doesn't contaminate my water. But in this situation though, I wanted to bring out the details we couldn't see earlier on the both the diviner as well as the monk. I didn't realize this before, but on the tabards that they have coming down from their chest, that khaki earth tone kind of tabard coming down the front of them, they actually have like this thin little piece of piping along there, as well as a fleur-de-lis on the bottom of those tabards. So to bring out that detail, I decided to use 2 thin coats of gunmetal gray, just because it contrasts nicely against the magenta that these guys have in their robes, as well as the earth tones of the tabards that they're wearing. For the next detail, we're going to actually dry brush the guns of the gun servitors real quick. We painted those in Anita's acrylic True Red earlier, and we're going to dry brush those with Tropic Orange so that we can see a lot of those details we couldn't see earlier, things like the individual mechanics of the weapons that they're actually carrying. As for the metallic elements on these characters, we're once again focusing on the piping of their robes. So for example, the interrogator, the guy with the machete, as well as the pistolier on the left hand side, they have this beautiful piping that goes along the length of their robes as well as their collars. So to bring out that detail, I'm using 2 thin coats of Deco Arts Emperor's Gold. It's a nice vibrant gold color that looks really nicely, that contrasts sharply with the reds as well as the black these characters are wearing as well. It also really catches your eye in that detail. We're also going to use a little pipe working of the Imperial Eagle that's on the left breast of the gunslinger as well. So for this next step, we're going to use these colors for all the fine details on these guys, especially when it comes to their leather goods. So let's talk about exactly how we did that. So we're going to use pigment paint for all the black leather goods, so things like belts and buckles that are crossing the pistolier's chest, for example. We're going to use burnt umber, for example, for the fur collar of the monk that's in there, the shotgun, as well as the belt of the actual auto savant over there as well. We're going to use pewter gray as well as some territorial beige for some of the leather goods on the penal corps colony soldier there in the center, as well as the guy the machetes. We're going to pick out his belt and territorial beige, and we're going to use Anita's acrylic moccasin brown for the leather goods of both the Death World penal soldier, so things like the belt and the sheaths that he has crisscrossing his body, as well as his boot knife. And we're going to do exactly the same thing for the leather goods of the interrogator there on the far right hand side. The next fine detail we're going to work on are things like the explosives that these guys are carrying, as well as the chainsword. For the guy who's the Death World veteran, I decided to pick out his details in 2 thin layers of ripe tomato, just because that ripe tomato color contrasts nicely with the holly branch we have in his trousers, so that way it looks like he's carrying different kinds of explosive materials. For the knight errant on the right hand side, he's got a frag grenade hooked up to his hips. I use holly branch for that color, so that way it contrasts nicely with the black robes that this character is wearing. As for the penal guy in the center, I'm going to warn you guys now, I decided to try to experiment by doing hazard striping on the chainsword. So originally I painted the chainsword body yellow because I planned on doing some black hazard stripes. Unfortunately, when I do the hazard stripes, I do a horrible job doing it. So because of that, I will decide to paint over the entirety of the yellow that we use for the chainsword and make it black instead, just because I just lost patience to try and do the hazard stripes after my second attempt. But that's okay though, because even though that color was wasted on this character, our paints are so cheap anyways, we could actually make those kind of mistakes and not really hurt our budget too badly. The next batch of details we're going to work on are on the gun servitors, and we're using this for all the tubes and cabling that are coming out of their bodies. As you see, they have a couple of tubes and stuff like that, so I decided to use marsh green for some of the cabling that's coming out of their body. Same thing with kiwi, I decided to use that for some of the sensors that they have scattered throughout their bodies. It was basically a piece of cabling from the wrist that they're wearing with little pinchers, so I decided to use that to bring out that power cable. I used King's Gold for some of the other cables, as well as Anita's acrylic True Red for some other cabling along their thighs and stuff as well. And once I bring out those elements, we can move on to our next group. And that next detailing is the branding that's on their left-hand arms. If you look at the left-hand arms, they have these huge inquisitorial eyes. It looks like it was branded directly into their flesh. So to bring out that detail, I use bright magenta by Apple Barrel paint for the fight on the left-hand side, as well as moccasin brown for the fight on the right-hand side to create that kind of burnt-looking scar that's branded on their arms. And the next major detail I work on their weapons, for example, on the lights that there are on these weapons. They have like these really cool looking lights on the back of their gun servitor sights, which I picked out in mermaid blue, as same thing with the power cables and coils along the plasma gun that's being carried by the other gun servitor. You can get this stuff at your local Hobby Lobby for about 65 cents. It's really cheap, and it has a beautiful color and contrasts nicely with the red color we used earlier. From there, I then used green turquoise by Apple Barrel paint. I put 2 thin dots directly on the eye lenses of these gun servitors to make it look like it's got this glowing in the dark kind of green sensor on their face masks. And speaking of servitors, we're going back to the book skull servitors that we have here originally, and we're going to do a couple of details from there. So what we're going to do is we're going to actually use a Deco Arts Magenta to pick out the details of the candles that are sitting on the top of their heads, and we're using King's Gold to create the little yellow flame from those candles. From the books, in order to make it look like the books are being held open by binders, we're going to use 2 thin stripes of Nita's True Red, which contrasts nicely with the light mocha that we use for the textbook pages that they're carrying, and then we're going to use 2 thin layers of green turquoise to bring out the little sensor eye for the gun servitor as well. And then from there, we're going to work on a lot of the metallic elements that are around these guys as well. So we're going to use a bunch of different colors for these guys for the metallic elements. We're going to use Folk Arts Copper, which costs 75 cents at your local Walmart. Anita's Acrylic Aged Copper, which you get you at your local Hobby Lobby for about 65 cents. Folk Arts Gunmetal Gray for 75 cents at your local Walmart. Anniversary Silver by Folk Art, which you can get for 75 cents at your local Walmart. And Deco Arts Emperor's Gold, which you can get your local Walmart for about 75 cents as well. And this kind of depends on the situation in which you're trying to paint on these miniatures. For the darker steel elements, like the guns, the blades, for example, I use Gunmetal Gray. For a lot of the iconography these guys are carrying, like for example the chainmail of the death world of the penal colony soldier, for example, or some of the jewelry these guys are using, I'm using Anniversary Silver just because a little bit of a blue tinge to it, which also looks kind of nice. Well, I use Anita's Aged Copper for things like gun barrels, suppressors, shrouds, magazines, that kind of thing. I also use the copper, for example, for other details like some of the jewelry they're wearing as well, like the giant eyes that they have on their chests, etc. And of course all the gold elements I used Deco Arts Emperor's Gold for all those gold elements. So once you're done picking out all those metallic elements for your miniatures, next thing you do now is start working on the finer details. So once again, there's a lot of fine details on these guys, so let's talk about that. I'm using lime sherbet for some of the piping as well as for some of the cabling that you're seeing. For example, like on the Death World, like for example, the Penal Corps soldier that's right in the front there. I'm using mermaid blue for things like power coils on the plasma pistol for the pistolier, for example, or eye lenses for some of these characters. I'm using bright magenta as well for some of the cabling that we're seeing spread throughout these guys, like with candles and stuff. I'm using cameo pink for that as well as the King's Gold for the flames coming off of those candles. We're using the taupe gray as well in order to bring out some of those details, like some of the flesh details that we're seeing along the things like the textbook pages, and the quills being carried by the little auto savant. So there's a lot of little small details spread throughout these miniatures that we're using these colors for in order to bring out those details. And then finally, we have 2 more colors we have left for all the details on these guys, which is the lenses of their eyes. So for example, the Knight Errant, for example, has got some eye lenses going on as well. We're using green turquoise to bring those out, as well as for the Auto Savant, he's got some oil quills along his body. We're going to use Holly Branch to bring out those little oil pots, ink pots that he has in order to write his materials. And once we're done with those last 2 details, these guys are completely done. So the next thing we need to work now is on the bases. So for the texturing of the bases, we're going to pick that on one thin layer of pavement paint. And the reason why I'm only using 1 layer of that is because even if some of the white undercoat pokes through, it's not a big deal because we're going to dry brush these with pale gray anyway, so that white's going to go away really quickly. Like I said before, I'm going to use these guys for our games in Necromunda, so I'm using the same kind of color scheme we use for our Necromunda miniatures. So next step, of course, is to dry brush the texturing on the bases, which we use is Folk Arts Pale Gray to do that. And as you can see, that white undercoat that we saw earlier, it doesn't really matter because it looks like it's part of the dry brushing. So these guys look absolutely amazing. And once we're done with that dry brushing on their bases, the next thing we do now is our oil wash. So for the oil wash stage, we're going to use a mid-wax poly shade in Mission Oak color, and the reason why we're using that is because it's a significantly cheaper option than using Army Painter Strong Tone. It does exactly the same thing as Army Painter Strong Tone. The only difference though is it only costs $6.99, while Army Painter Strong Tone costs $30.99 per can for that. So we're going to apply this wash all over the entirety of the miniatures as well as the bases. Now the oil wash is going to do a couple things for us. The first thing it's going to do, it's going to seep directly into the recesses of the miniatures, bringing a lot of those details we couldn't see earlier. So things like individual folds of the fabric, the texturing on the bases, and as you can see there with the Auto Savant, the individual scripture written down directly onto the scroll work. It does an amazing job bringing those details in those recesses that we couldn't see earlier. The second thing that it also does, it also smooths out the transitions between our base coats as well as our dry brushing, and if you can tell, that chalky kind of pastel look that we had earlier is now gone because it's blended those colors together and smoothed out those transitions. And the last thing that the oil wash also does as well is that it also darkens down the vibrancy of the colors that we use on our miniatures, which is why we use such bright colors in the first place, because we knew that oil wash was going to mute them down by the time we actually use them. Now you will need to let this stuff dry and cure for about 24 hours, and the reason why that is the case is because the mid-wax poly shade does have polyurethane in it, just like its Army Painter counterpart. So now that we're done painting the oil wash, the next thing we do, of course, is to rim the bases of the miniatures. I decided to use 2 thin layers of Folk Art Skyline, which you can get 75 cents at your local Walmart. And the reason why I use that color is because it's exactly the same color you use for all of the Necromunda miniatures in our studio's collection. So I just put 2 thin layers around the base, and the last thing I do, of course, is to spray them with a matte spray. I like using Krylon matte varnish spray because it's cheap. It costs $5.99, and it meets down the glossiness, that high shine gloss that you get from the polyurethane. Now, obviously, if you do like that high gloss finish, you can skip this step because it's completely optional. And as you can see, this is the end result that we showed you guys earlier at the very beginning of the video. And as you can see, we have our miniatures brought up to a beautiful tabletop standard, and it costs us less than $30 in order to paint these guys as well. So that being said, let's talk about the materials that you need to buy from both Army Painter as well as Citadel if you wanted to paint your miniatures exactly the same way we did, but using their name brand paints instead. Alright, so these are the materials that you need to buy from both Army Painter and Citadel if you want to paint exactly the same way we did, but using their name brand paints instead. You'll need to buy Thunderhawk Blue, Baneblade Brown, Averland Sunset, Longbeard Gray, Fulgrim Pink, Teclis Blue, Caliban Green, Screamer Pink, Luganeth Orange, Cyberite Green, Blue Horror, Bugman's Glow, Cadian Fleshtone, Morghast Brown, Baylor Brown, Moot Green, Slanesh Gray, Eshin Gray, Trollslayer Orange, Pink Horror, Flayed One Flesh, Rust Gray, Doom Bull Brown, Ulthuan Gray, Mephiston Red, as well as Rakarth Flesh, and each of those pots only give you 10 millimeters and it's going to cost you $4.55 per pot. And each of those are anywhere between 9 to 7 times as much as the cheap craft paints that I use in my miniatures. From there, you also need to buy Wildwood, Pterodon Turquoise, Talazar Blue, Brass Scorpion, Lead Belcher, Screaming Bell, Ironbreaker, and Asher Granite, Athematic Blue, and Retributor Armor, and each of those colors cost $7.80 for those pots as well, which is anywhere between 10 to 11 times more than what I use for my cheap stuff. From there, you also need to buy a can of Corax White Spray for your primer, which is going to cost you $17, a can of Munitorium Varnish for $19.50 if you want to have a matte finish on your miniatures, as well as a can of Army Painter Strong Tone for $32 for your oil wash. Now, assuming that you're purchasing all those materials for the very first time, you're talking about a grand total investment of $264.80. And when you compare that with our cheapskate method of only $37.37, and you subtract the two, we're talking about a grand total savings of $227.43. So there you guys have it. This is how you guys can quickly and more importantly cheaply paint up your Kill Team Inquisitorial Agents for your games of Kill Team, or in my case, Necromunda. As you can see, we saved you guys over $260 by showing you some really cheap ways of actually using cheap materials to paint up your miniatures. So if you're one of those kind of guys who are looking for ways to save money on the wargaming hobby and you're looking for a way to cut costs, may I suggest using the cheap craft paints because it does exactly the same thing for a fraction of the price. So that's good to do for this week, guys. As always, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. You guys' input is valuable to us as always. Also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, as well as blogger.com for all the latest greatest hobby news related to this channel. That's good for this week, guys. We'll catch you guys next one. Peace out and stay classy.